Hey everyone, my name is Charlie and today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in February 2014. That's right, it's another retrospective. Last time that I did one of these videos, I had forgotten a lot of these books. I'm going to admit that I have already looked at the books that I read 10 years ago. When I looked at them, I thought, my goodness, there's a lot of comic books and graphic novels here. And I realised that this was the time when I was going back and forth to the hospital and the doctors a lot, trying to figure out why I hadn't slept for nearly 6 months. And I was just having these constant migraines, which came with these olfactory hallucinations. Eventually got diagnosed with a chronic migraine syndrome. But it was looking back at these books that reminded me of that, because I thought, well, why did I read all these? The first book that I read in February 2014 is The Amazing Spider-Man Coming Home. I was reminding myself of the comic books that I hadn't read for years. I started reading the X-Men comic books after my granddad died. It was this weird thing, this coincidence that I happened to go into W.H. Smith, or was I at the I think we were at the hospital, and I saw X-Men versus Death, which is where Wolverine became a Horseman of Apocalypse. My granddad had just died, and then I got this where Wolverine was Death, and it was this whole thing. But then from then on, my cousin went and bought me another one, and then my mum kept buying them for me every month, and I would keep reading these X-Men comics. I was never a fan of Spider-Man, but I think it was just something that my library had at the time. Can't I tell you anything about The Amazing Spider-Man Coming Home? No. I think it was me just wanting to find something that was also quick and easy to digest. The next one I read was They Do It With Mirrors by Agatha Christie. And this, I know, is one that I probably should reread. It's a Miss Marple. And in terms of the Miss Marple series, I tend to know a lot of the stories because that's what I used to watch when I was younger. That's what I regularly watched with my grandparents when I was around their house. I went and watched all of the Geraldine McEwen ones and Julia Mackenzie that was on ITV. When it came to reading them, oftentimes I found that I'd preferred how they were adapted, and They Do It With Mirrors is not one of my favourite Miss Marple stories. It's not one of my favourite Christies. I don't find it particularly memorable in that I can't remember it at all, whereas there are other Agatha Christie's that have stuck in my mind, either due to the ingenuity within the plotline or just the way that it was written. At Bertram's Hotel, which is really not a very good mystery story at all, it's not one of Agatha Christie's best, is one that has a special place in my heart, even though it's not a standout of hers. But They Do It With Mirrors? No, I just don't care for that one. Then we have a book of which I do not know the author, but I can remember reading this one, and it is When I Loved Myself Enough. I can remember obviously feeling really down with all of these migraines that I was having and the fact that I hadn't slept for so long. I don't think at this point I'd agreed to take the medication to help me sleep. I saw this in the back room of the charity shop back when we were only in Macclesfield, and we were in a much smaller shop, which is a pub now. Well, it's a bar. I went and I read this in the very few minutes that there were whilst I was waiting for a kettle to boil. Then we have Astonishing X-Men Unmasked and Wolverine and the X-Men, Volume 3, and Uncanny X-Men Broken. I mention all three together because I read them all on the same day. All I can remember of going back to reading these comic books after it had been so long since I'd read them is that, one, I didn't like the fact that it was Wolverine and the X-Men. I think it was also to tie in with the TV show that had come out in about 5 years earlier. I just feel like he's an overused character and he's not one of my favourites. And, I was all here, about Storm, Scarlet Witch. Those characters were favourites of mine. That's all I remember, being annoyed at the idea that it was Wolverine and the X-Men. I also remember not liking the style of art from any of these, and that's it. I don't remember anything more. Then we have Wonder Woman Love and Murder. I cannot remember ever having read a Wonder Woman comic book in my life, but I really was just exploring all of the comic books and graphic novels that my library had on offer, And at this point, it really just seemed like Marvel or DC. It was only a few months later that I discovered that they actually had graphic novels that were written to be graphic novels as opposed to comic book bind-ups. Then we have Buffy the Vampire Slayer: The Long Way Home. I do not like the extended Buffy the Vampire series universe into the comic books. I like that it manages to do things that could never be shown on television. So we get to see Willow going off into other realms, we get to see things happening in space. It does follow the same sort of storyline as the TV show in that we are leading up to discovering who a certain big bad is. And it also helps to tie up the series end of Angel. But I just don't like the comic books. Then we have The Night Bookmobile by Audrey Niffenegger. I really remember adoring this book at the time. I thought that it was a spectacular take on depression and grief and finding life tough, and this almost fairy tale-esque aspect of this graphic novel. I can remember really enjoying this one. And The Night Bookmobile is one that I still recommend to people when asked for graphic novel recommendations. Then we have The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Ship of Her Own Making by Catherynne and Valente. I'd got this the previous Christmas. It was incredibly popular. I remember really adoring this book, liking the almost take on Alice in Wonderland. I really just enjoyed the whimsy of it all. I've just remembered that at the same time as reading that book, I was writing my own children's book as well. So I was so enthusiastic about these whimsical books. And one of my issues always with whimsy is that sometimes authors will start writing whimsical tales and they will lose that tone very quickly. And then it just descends into being very typical of the genre. Whereas with this book, the author managed to maintain that air of whimsy throughout the entire story. However, it has been 10 years. It's actually 10 years to the day nearly since I read that book. And although I wanted to read the sequels, I've never gone to the sequels. And it's almost as though I worry that they might soil my enjoyment of that first book. Indeed, it's one that I've never gone back to reread because I know that I'm such a different reader now that I worry it would be one that I ended up not enjoying as much, which is something that has happened with other books when I've gone back to revisit them after them previously being a favourite that I really wanted to reread and reread. Then we have Batgirl Rising. All I remember about this one is being utterly confused because it was around the time that DC was having another one of its big retcons. I started reading this only for DC to decide that they were getting rid of this Batgirl entirely. I didn't know enough about the history to understand what was going on in this graphic novel, and 10 years later I can remember that. I can remember that with DC vividly. It was the fact that the books had so much history, and if you didn't know it, you were just kind of left by the wayside. Then we have Divergent by Veronica Roth. I remember speeding through this book. It was the popular YA series at the time. I read both Insurgent and Allegiant about a week later, but they're in March, so I'll talk about them when I do March's retrospective. Definitely a product of its time, when YA dystopia was the big thing. And when I look back on it, I recognise that really there was not a lot of substance in its pages. It was a bit of a cookie cutter type of situation of what was popular at the time. And I can remember reading it quickly because it was written it had a fast pace and not a lot to think about really. You know, as one of the last young adult series I read, this probably should have been my moment to recognise, no, this is when you need to tap out. And then finally, in February 2014, I read Batman Streets of Gotham Leviathan. Like Wonder Woman before, I didn't know I'd ever read a Batman comic book, nor did I know that I'd read a comic book bind-up, but I did, and 10 years later, I don't remember this experience at all. I suppose that what we're finding with looking back at 10 years is that, one, it's interesting to look at it in terms of who I am as a reader, and recognising that sometimes when I've read books incredibly quickly, I've forgotten them, which is what happens with the comic books. On the converse of that, I know that there is a book later on that was a graphic novel that became one of my favourite graphic novels, and I still laud this graphic novelist above all others. It was also pre-Booktube, and it was pre-really sharing my reading with anybody. And so I was at a time in my life here where I was trying to make reading enjoyable for myself again. And I was reading terrible things. Like, I don't mean terrible. I was reading things that didn't really have substance in the grand scheme of things, because I had spent so long at uni having to analyse what every single writer was doing when they were writing a piece of fiction to figure out, well, why did the author do this? What were they hoping to convey with this? Or why did the author do this in terms of craft? And so it spoiled my reading. Towards the end of 2013, I'd actually really slowed down because I just couldn't get out of this habit of having to look at things so closely. I think I'm still there with the books that I was reading in 2014, trying to get out of this way of thinking of having to examine everything craft-wise. And it's only as I've looked at these books that I remember that I was getting diagnosed with the migraine syndrome. I was trying to pull myself out of the person I'd had to be at university, of always having to analyse why an author was doing something in terms of the writing of the thing. It will be interesting to see what I read the following month, because I know, as I said in the last video, that this is the last year that I read young adult fiction, and so I can see myself already making that transition into reading more adult books, and the way that I started doing that. So yeah, February 2014, read quite a few books that I have no recollection of, but we did have 2 in there that went on to become books that I still recommend to folk today. And them's the books. If you've read any of these books and would like to discuss them, then please feel free to do so in the comments. Are you a comic book reader? If so, who are some of your favourite characters? I hope that you have enjoyed this video, because until next time, that is all.